looks like we're now live for the next AMA Ask Me Anything session. This one is for the month of September 2018. Let me get a little bit more light over here. See if we can fix the lighting a bit. Been shooting some video this morning on Aristotle's Politics, Book 1. So also let me put the link to and thanks for the Patreon support. I should say something about that. As all of you know, my video work, including this, all the public philosophy stuff that I do, is generally being underwritten by Patreon supporters. So if you want to see more of this sort of thing, it's always a good idea to chip in a little bit. Looks like we already have quite a few questions lined up for me ahead of time. People got there beforehand this time, so that's good. Let me get there we go, live chat. So Carl Bad asks, can I give a quick AMA version core concept as to what the hell is going on in the second half of the Charmides, when Charmides answers temperance as modesty, then discretion, that's fine. But when Socrates and Critias begin to talk about the science that knows itself, I'm entirely lost. Okay, so that's a good question. Yeah, they're trying to figure out what sophrosune, which we translate as temperance, actually is. That's one of the key, cardinal virtues that Plato recognized, that the Stoics would recognize. What is temperance? So this is an operatic dialogue. It's one of the early ones, scholars think, where they never do arrive at a satisfactory conclusion, but Socrates does lead us through a lot of interesting possibilities. And one of the ways in which this gets discussed is that maybe temperance would actually be a kind of wisdom or knowledge of the other things, right? And this is something that Plato plays with, but never, I would say, never really satisfactorily works out. And I think it's important to keep in mind that when Plato is doing these discussions of knowledge, sometimes he's going to lead you down blind paths that are not going to turn out to be the best way to formulate things. And so viewing temperance, or even viewing wisdom itself, as sort of the overarching knowledge of knowledge or understanding of all the other arts or sciences, is not going to be a very successful strategy. So that is that's what's going on there in a nutshell. And actually, down the line, that's a dialogue. I have a lot of interest in it. That's a dialogue I should do some core concept videos about, maybe put together like a mini course in my Gregory B. Sadler Teachable Academy thing. All right. Now, Philosophy, Religion, Self asks, could you please elaborate on Stoicism and Plato's theory of forms? Well, the Stoics don't accept Plato's theory of forms. The Stoics are materialists, so that's kind of a non-starter right there. They don't believe that there is some sort of eternal realm of the unchanging forms out there. All right, Zana Scarlett. Hi, Dr. Gregory. Could you please put some emphasis to what exactly Hegel is alluding to when he talks about Bacchanalian revels in the preface section to the Phenomenology? Me and my friend debate it. So in the Bacchanalian revel, and he's using that as a metaphor there, right? In the Bacchanalian revel, everybody is like totally drunk and intoxicated, and they're kind of losing sight of limits of where one person ends and another person begins. They're probably also getting it on, quite frankly, and dancing and doing all sorts of other stuff as well. And so that's the illusion, right? And for Hegel, that's kind of nice, right? You can have all this cool stuff going on, but Hegel is all about differentiation and showing how things are connected to each other in a conceptual way. So a Bacchanalian revel can't be the end of the story, right? Whereas for some philosophers, it could be. That could be the thing that you really aim at. Here's a more personal question. Googly moogly, where is your favorite, most awe-inspiring place you've traveled to in your career? So favorite and awe-inspiring. I'd have to think about the awe-inspiring bit. Favorite, you know, I haven't actually traveled that much myself. I've been to quite a few places in Europe, and I've been to parts of Canada, and I've been to a good bit of the United States, although I've never actually been west of Colorado. So I'm not all that well traveled. I will say that one of my favorite places that I'd like to go back to in terms of countries is Portugal, because I liked the weather, and I wasn't in the south. I was like from Lisbon on up, right into to the north. I'd really like to go back there sometime. Lots of beautiful art, azulejo all over the place, and houses are really cool, and great food, great drink. So that was one of my favorite places. And then, all these wonderful museums and places to go to check things out. Awe-inspiring. That's a little bit tougher to say. I'd have to think about that one. Maybe I'll get back to you on that one. All right, Adam. It is death for philosophy to be intelligible. Is it necessary to be obscure for philosophy? What are thoughts on metaphorical language and their interpretations? I don't think it's death for philosophy to be intelligible, and it depends on what you're trying to do. As a matter of fact, a lot of philosophy is trying to make things intelligible, isn't it? Struggling, and we never do get away from metaphor in language. We're always using metaphor to some degree, and so the people who are really big on metaphor and who are cautioning us against its deforming effects or things like that, they're on point about that. But that's not the end of the story. It's not as if we're always off base. It's just part of the way things work. I mean, just think about that term off base, right? That comes from baseball, I think, or maybe it comes from somewhere else. But you can grasp the meaning of it. We're not totally at a loss when it comes to that. So is it necessary to be obscure for philosophy? No. And obscurity for its own sake is just silly. I'll give you a different example from religion. I'd have all these very conservative Catholic friends who, would go to Latin masses, which you can find every once in a while, and they'd be like, "Oh, it makes me feel like it's such a wonderful ritual." And I'd be like, "You don't understand Latin. What the hell are you getting out of it?" And they'd be like, "Well, it's because I don't understand it. It makes it feel so much more mysterious." And I'd be like, "Boy, you've really got things backwards, don't you? The whole point is to actually understand what the hell is going on, not just to mystify yourself or fill yourself with all sorts of airy, senses of how transcendental it is. You should figure out what the hell is actually being said." And I think philosophy is like that too. There's, Aristotle talks about this in the Nicomachean Ethics. He says that there's quite a few people who see philosophers or other people talking about big topics, and they're like, "Wow, that's really cool," but they don't understand anything that they're talking about. And they just think that that's really neat. And they're sort of like left, you might say, if we want to use a metaphor, a spatial metaphor, they're left in the antechamber, and they're not going into the place to see what is actually in there and see whether it's good or garbage. All right, here's another one from Googly Moogly. Do I agree that Camus is like Nietzsche light? No. I would say Camus is dealing with his own stuff, and he's definitely, I mean, he's somebody who's read Nietzsche and talks about Nietzsche at different points. He knows why he differs from Nietzsche. And, if you want to see Camus' more developed work, you look at, his later essays, and in particular at the Rebel, and there, he's working with things that Nietzsche chose not to go down, in terms of his ideas. Adam Titor, what are your thoughts on Hermeticism and other esoteric teachings? I'm not an expert on that sort of thing, so I don't have anything really to contribute in that sense. It's not, from what I've read and encountered of it, it's not worth the scarce time that I have to invest in learning more about it or studying it, because it doesn't do much to illuminate. I don't get a lot of bang for my buck time-wise, that sort of stuff. And when I want to know more about that, I go to some of my scholarly friends who actually do spend a lot of time on it, and I say, hey, what about this? What about that? And they fill me in on it. So for me, it's not anything that I see as worth my time. I don't have enough time to actually get the things done that I want to get done, or that I commit to doing sometimes. Luca, would you be willing to travel with a transporter that scans and destroys your body and then recreates an exact copy in different location, like Star Trek, right? I guess for me, the answer would be yes. And you could say, yeah, but what about the fact that you're dying in the transporter? Yeah, but I mean, we're dying every day, right? And being recreated as a new being bit by bit by bit. And if that being really did, I mean, this is assuming that transporter technology could in fact transport the person rather than just the bodily composition. Let's say we are like thoroughgoing materialists and we do believe that consciousness can be totally encapsulated in some physical matrix. I would do it, sure. I'd go all over the place then, right? I'd save myself a lot of travel time. So that's good. Adam Titor, your favorite poets? I don't read a lot of poetry, quite honestly. Especially, I don't read a lot of contemporary stuff. My favorite poet is Rainer Maria Rilke, but I like him not just for his poetry, but for his prose, right? I don't get a lot of time to read other poets. I do like epic poetry and dramatic poetry, but that's not what we typically think of as poetry today. All right, here's a good question from Lecomir, I think how it's pronounced. You're recommending reading original texts over textbook secondary literature. Why can't we pack the useful insights from ancient figures into textbook form while omitting ancient obsolete parts? Yeah, go ahead. I mean, you don't know what you're missing, of course, unless you mean the we as us scholars who are doing that for you. And that's what I do like in my videos and my own resources. But I'm always saying you shouldn't deprive yourself of the opportunity of actually reading it for yourself. I mean, why be satisfied with somebody at several removes from the actual thinker or text, particularly when, if you want to read Plato today, hell, it's available online everywhere, nobody's standing in your way. You don't have to be a member of a club or, pay a lot of money to go to a class or something like that, or go to some monastery where the only copy of it is kept. You can download it on your phone, right? What's to stop you from doing that? You don't even have to read it. You can actually have somebody read it to you by going to LibriVox, or if you want to pay money for Audible, do that, right? So, the other part is you don't actually know what's ancient or obsolete until you read the thing. It's sort of like you don't know whether it's a good translation or not unless you can read the original or you trust some other person who can. And, there's also, I think, something else that goes along with it. You don't really know a thinker until you read through their corpus of works and you read into those parts that you think are ancient or obsolete. And then you start to see maybe some of them, parts of them may be, and then parts of them might really still be very on point. But you don't really grasp a thinker unless you read through their works, not just summaries of them. So I'm always directing people to go back to the primary texts. Radiant. What are some possible reasons for the return of Stoicism in modern times? Well, one reason is that it never actually went away completely. So we're not talking about a return like it was completely off the scene and then boom, now it's back. There have always been some people interested in and studying Stoicism. You can find references, throughout. Sometimes they get things a bit wrong or they emphasize the wrong part, but part of it is also the availability of texts and the fact that, as opposed to like some other thinkers who, like Aristotle's worth reading, right? But is there an easy introduction to Aristotle? No. You might read the categories and that, by the time you get to chapter 2, you're like, what the hell is this crap, right? Or you read the Nicomachean Ethics or the Politics or On the Soul. With Epictetus, you can read the Enchiridion, or Seneca, you can read some of the letters, or one of the Consolations. Marcus Aurelius, you can read that kind of disorganized meditations, and then you can get it more into the other stuff. And I think it's also, we are in a time when people are looking for philosophies of life. Again, Aristotelianism could be that, but you have to study a bit and understand a bit to make Aristotelianism work. Stoicism is a little bit easier to take right out of the box, you might say. There's some concepts that are tricky and sometimes a bit misleading, like the whole what's in accordance with nature, what's not in accordance with nature. I'm working on a book about that precisely because it's not as simple as just, what's rational or, things like that, the way a lot of people want to, sort of dumb it down. But, it's relatable, and it does help people with things like emotional management and goal setting and resilience and all these things that ordinary people can relate to, or people in the professions might benefit from. So I think that's part of it. And then there's also, and this is part of why I got involved with the modern Stoic movement in the first place, there are some people involved with it who really have their proverbial crap together and are doing great work in publicizing it and popularizing it, and that includes the modern Stoicism team. So I think that's a big part of it. Adam is asking for something that I can't possibly supply you with. The most precise definition of love, in your opinion? I think a lot of you know from previous things, I'm not a big definition guy. I don't try to supply definitions for most things. And I'm sure not going to try to define love. That's certainly an analogical at best term, probably equivocal term. It's somewhere in the range of affection or affectivity, right? And it's a positive one directed at people. But man, there's a lot of different kinds of things rolled into love. So I'm not going to be able to give you one. Googly Moogly, what's your opinion on podcasts such as The Partially Examined Life, Philosophize This, or Very Bad Wizards? Well, I've been on The Partially Examined Life once for an after show. Never got asked back, so I don't know what the deal is with that. And for my taste, there's a bit too much joking around and flying by the seat of their pants on occasion. But it serves a purpose, gets people interested in philosophy. Never listened to Philosophize This, unless I'm trying to remember who does that one. And I've been on podcasts from time to time, but I don't have that much time for listening to podcasts, in part because, I'm very busy, and the free time that I do have is generally spent, exercising, in which case I'm listening to metal, or, with my wife and my kids and our pets. Or the rare social occasions that we get. So I don't get a lot of time to listen to podcasts. So I'm not a good person to ask about that, because I'm more of a producer than a consumer, you might say. If I was smart, I'd be listening to them just to see what's catching on and what I might do a thing on. But right now I'm just too busy. All right, Anonymous, what is your view on free will? If free will doesn't exist, should we even bother with the legal system? So two very different questions. I think we do have free will. I think that free will isn't what a lot of people who talk about free will make it out to be, where it's like this total, liberty of indifference. You could do anything you want. No, I mean, we exist within a causal matrix. It just happens that the causal matrix is a hell of a lot more complicated than sort of crude determinists would like to make it out to be or wish it to be. Because you got to always ask about these people who are like hardcore determinists. What are you getting out of this, buddy? What's your angle here? Why do you get so worked up about it if people don't have free will? And say, well, they're fated to do that. So I do think there's free will, but we have to give a much more complicated picture of what it would be, and it's often just a tiny little sliver. It's not some massive thing, and free will can be hampered by many things. But here's an interesting question. So if free will does not exist, should we even bother with the legal system? Yeah, of course. Because if free will doesn't exist, then it was determined that the legal system would come into being. And, just like every other mechanism, why not leave it just as it is? When I was teaching in the prison, some of you may know my first 6 years of full-time teaching was at Indiana State Prison, and I would teach this intro to philosophy class, and we would talk about free will. Every single time there'd be some guy who'd be like, oh yeah, determinism. If that's true, then I shouldn't be in here. I shouldn't be getting punished because I couldn't help, doing what I did. And then the next guy sitting next to him would say, you dummy. Don't you understand that if you can't, you couldn't have done anything differently, then that guard out there couldn't have done anything differently, and the judge couldn't have done anything differently. You can't play favorites. If you're going to be a determinist, you got to apply it across the board. You can't just say, I get a free pass from it because determinism and everybody else should choose to do things differently as a result. So, you could say this about any other system that might seem arbitrary, unjust, or attributing too much to people. Now, that's not to say that we can't look at the legal system and say, hey, there's ways in which this could be made much more humane, or we should allow leniency in this case because this person had much less of an opportunity to exercise free will than this other person. So I'm cool with that sort of thing, but the idea that punishment then is taken off the books because no free will, I don't buy that at all, and neither do people in prison. Most of them. Another one from Anonymous. How do we improve the K through 12 system in the United States? I've heard that the school system used to teach Latin, also used to teach the classical works. Some school systems did. There is no school system in the United States. There is no K through 12 system. There's an incredible patchwork, and each state has got its own different thing. Each local school board does its own thing. Each school within there is doing its own thing. There are some federal standards, there are some state standards, but hey, so much of it is local. I think that if you want to try to change things in K through 12, find a local school and get involved with that and get on the school board and, start studying educational theory. Some of it's garbage, some of it's really great, and there's a lot in between so that you actually have some credibility when you start talking about that. If you want to be able to say that there's a case for teaching kids Latin, that's a hard sell. So you got to be able to go in and talk to people who don't share that as an automatic perspective and make the case to them. But I would do it locally. I would not try to change it in a broad sense because you're going to get so bogged down. Once things work locally and they start showing improvement that's demonstrable among the students, then that becomes a possible model for other people. So that's what I would do. All right, scrolling back up because I jumped over a bunch of stuff. Let's see. Mike Goodman is asking a very general question: how to decide between justice or liberty? Why not both? You know, why not try to reconcile them? And then, liberty in what sense? Liberty and justice, both equivocal terms. As Aristotle pointed out in the case of justice, and we could point out very easily in the case of liberty. Liberty in what sense? So once you clarify that, then I think you can start to resolve that. Fahad Saeed, I want to pursue philosophy academically, even though I'm done with an undergraduate degree in engineering. How to go about this? That's a good question. I mean, you can do another degree. If you want to do it academically, you got to find an academic institution. There's quite a few online, and you can look around for those. They're going to vary considerably in quality. Some online stuff is basically just correspondence courses with a few videos perhaps thrown in, many of which are pretty crappy. Some are incredibly well put together and sophisticated. But if you're pursuing it academically, you're trying to get another degree, right? If you're not doing it academically, but you want to do it like along the lines of academic, look for open access courses. And there's a wide variety of stuff out there. I offer some in my Teachable Academy. There's all sorts of other platforms as well where you can find good courses. LB, thank you for putting so much energy into this YouTube channel. Your videos have helped me get through several philosophy courses and a much better understanding of the material. It means a lot. Well, I'm glad that's the case. And I had a guy actually, some of you may know from my social media, who stopped me on the street 2 days ago as I was walking one of our dogs, and said, "Oh," he rolled his window down. "Are you Greg Sadler?" And I was like, "Yeah." So he got out and he's like, "Oh, I watched your Heidegger videos, and then it helped me through my course at Emory." And he wanted to thank me. And he did. Interestingly, he's a Marquette grad student, but didn't know that I'm teaching at Marquette this semester. There's a lot of things like that, and I'm glad that it is helpful. I do have to figure out how to get wider distribution of these videos, because it seems like a lot of people are not, because they're crowded out by the glitzy 5-minute this and that channel stuff. I got to figure out a better way to get people to know about it. So if you guys want to post about the videos, post a video and say, "I found this really helpful," that might also help as well. Brian, what do you make of Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche? Do you think it's faithful to him? I know that Kaufman is not a fan of it. Well, we could ask the same thing about Kaufman's reading of Nietzsche, right? Nobody's reading of Nietzsche is entirely faithful to Nietzsche. Don't expect that. It's more a question of, is it an interesting reading? Can you learn from it? Where do you think it's like off base, and where do you think it's on track, right? Same thing with Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche, or Stanley Rosen, or whoever you want to pick, right? As a matter of fact, this is a total digression, but I used to, I was sort of a Kaufman reading guy when I first got to grad school, and there was another guy there who had studied with Stanley Rosen, and he and I used to argue back and forth about how to interpret Nietzsche when I was still going through my Nietzsche phase. So, what about Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche? Hey, when you read Heidegger on anybody, you're getting half that person and half Heidegger, right? Which is not necessarily a bad thing. If you wanted to just go to Nietzsche himself, you can certainly do that. But you go to these great other thinkers on this thinker, so you can learn something more about it. Something that you might be missing in the text that they're highlighting. And I think Heidegger, I think he's on the right track. Nihilism really is one of the central problems. The will to power really is at the core of Nietzsche's metaphysics. I think he's right about those sorts of things. David, what would be the Stoic approach on the fear of public speaking? Well, that's a good question. And this is a very, very widespread fear. And it's interesting because you can also be afraid. You can be good in one genre and then be like totally petrified going into another genre. Like I know academics who can get up in front of a class and lecture without notes for an hour, but you ask them to give like a speech at a wedding or something like that, and they're just petrified. Or ask them to go on camera, and they can't do it. They start getting shakes and stuff. So, I mean, there's more to be said about this, but I would say what the Stoics would counsel is looking at the object of your fear, thinking about what it is that you're actually afraid of happening, what it is that could go wrong, and then ask yourself, okay, so why the hell does this scare me so much? Let's say, take something that is a very common fear that people express when they're talking about this. What if I can't remember what I want to say? Well, then you can't remember what you want to say. And people will either like laugh at you and say, oh, look at that jackass, or they'll be more sympathetic and maybe some of them will try to prompt you, or but it won't be the end of the world. It's not going to destroy you if you screw up. I mean, I'll tell you this, as I'm editing my videos into podcast lectures, I realize just how much I say, right, and a few other things. So I say that a lot too. And that's just the way it is, If you listen to other practice speakers, they do that too. I just did it right there, see? But you can also think about, well, what's really driving these fears? And this is where, Stoicism might be useful to use an adjunct to it, like thinking about, depth psychology or other things as well. Why are you afraid of looking foolish? Because, when you were a kid and you looked foolish, people would take it out on you. Okay, well, then you could say, this isn't like that. This isn't this sort of situation. Or if they do, is that really going to damage who you are in yourself? And you can do this sort of incrementally, and that can help you through it. And then, of course, you do have to get up in front of a crowd and public speak and probably have things not go entirely according to plan, not go entirely in accordance with your wishes, but things still turn out okay. And then you remind yourself of that. One thing you could do is actually have, if you have the opportunity for this, create a little thing that people can write on and ask them what they thought of the speech. And then, they can tell you, well, this is great, or this sucked, or whatever. And that can help you out. So, all right. Jisan, what do you think of the dialectic of enlightenment's critique of people seeing the world as an amorphous mechanical mass that no longer see things as they truly are? Is it just nonsense? I don't really remember that too well. It's been a while since I've read Dialectic of Enlightenment. That's Horkheimer and Adorno's book. People seeing the world as an amorphous mechanical mass that no longer sees things as they truly are. So that's ideology, right? What do I think of their critique of ideology? It's on point in some parts, and it's probably off base in others. And you got to remember, it was written. Anything that's written that's ideology critique is always going to be, by the time that we're reading it, probably a little bit behind the times. So that you don't want to take it as sort of like it's gospel truth or something like that. Emil, what is your position on epistemological justification? I don't have one, actually, but is there a way around using axioms, or are we fated to using unfounded axioms, foundationalism? Why do we have to think about it in terms of axioms at all? Why can't we think about it in terms of networks? Why can't we think about it in other models? Are we committed to like a very sort of, mechanical block work kind of way of understanding things? I don't think so. I don't think that's the way we actually experience the world or learn things. But I mean, if you're stuck with that, if you're gonna take that way, then you are kind of screwed, right? You're either gonna have axioms, or then you're gonna have to have some unfounded axioms, right? But there's no reason why you have to start out with that sort of set of assumptions. Roj, can you elaborate a little bit on the categorical imperative? So that's an idea coming from Kant, right? And by the way, I'd recommend the whole series of videos that I've got in the Kant playlist discussing the different formulations from the groundwork of the categorical imperative. That might help out. And actually, I'm going to be bringing out a class on Kant sometime, either this year or next year. So you might look for that. So the categorical imperative is this sort of exceptionless norm. That's what makes it categorical. It's not hypothetical. That Kant formulates three different ways. And the first two formulations are the ones that we get the most mileage out of. Those are framed in terms of universalization or in terms of, treating people as ends. There's like actual formulas for these. Act always on the maxim that you can will at the same time to be a universal law of nature. And then you can go through sort of like a decision process about how you would use that. The second one is act always so as to treat humanity and yourself and others, never merely as a means, but always as an end. Again, you can go through like a whole sort of checklist almost for how to do that. But it's a useful guideline in moral decision making. All right, Uffe Lingdahl Sørensen, where do you position yourself in relation to speculative realism? I don't. I don't actually position myself much, period. I'm already kind of just stuck in position. And I don't read enough speculative realism stuff to have much to say about it, right? There's Weig. How do you personally distinguish between news and fake news? That's a good question. Well, certain news sources are more likely to be fake news. And we probably need a typology of fake news. There's the stuff that's just utter bullshit drivel, right? And then there's like the stuff where it's kind of plausible, but they took things out of context and twisted it their way and left out important, rebuttals. And then there's the stuff where it's like deliberate, misinformation that's being spread. There's the stuff that's like wishful thinking, fake news, there's a lot of stuff. And there's plenty of information sources where like you should head into those information sources like thinking, yeah, this is probably going to be mostly bullshit here, right? And there's plenty on the left and there's plenty on the right. So there's that. Quite frankly, for all of his talk about fake news, I get the White House briefings, the little thing, I subscribe to it, so I find out what the White House is saying about stuff every day. And you should probably consider that mostly fake news. The spin on that is incredible, right? And now that's not to say that the Obama White House wasn't doing that too, or the W. Bush White House wasn't, or the Clinton White House wasn't. But man, this administration really, really spinning things. There's some news sources. One of the things you got to do is when you read a news story, you got to read it through, and then you check to see whether anybody else is reporting it and what they're leaving out in the first news story that modifies it, right? Because a lot of the stuff that's reported about Trump or about his administration is also bullshit. And you got to just compare sources. Some sources are going to be more reliable, and you figure that out over time, and you start to trust them, but you don't trust absolutely because they can always go downhill. So that's about as much as I can say about how to do that. Hosan, how to start studying and practicing critical thinking? Should we start with philosophy, logic, or some nature and physics? I would start with actual critical thinking textbooks in that case. They're going to teach you how to identify arguments when they're being made, what the parts of them are, how to identify at least some of the informal fallacies, how to, make and break arguments. That's a good start. And then, often they'll have other things that can lead you to other places. And look at the bibliography, because that'll refer you then to sort of better sources. And then there's like a whole literature out there. You could call critical thinking sort of like what epistemology is when you're doing it in a way that's much more close to the ground, than academic epistemology. So you don't actually need to start studying nature and physics. You're never going to get done with that before doing critical thinking. And by the way, I'm a huge booster when it comes to how we define critical thinking, and define in the very broad sense, not in the very like here's the one sentence definition of what we call the APA Delphi report. There's other models of critical thinking out there, some of which are complete bullshit, some of which are good in some respects, but the APA Delphi report, the executive summary, which was put out years and years ago, you just type it into Google and you should be able to download it. That tells you what a lot of the key components of critical thinking should look like. And it was put together by experts in the field. So, not just people trying to make a buck on talking about critical thinking. So, Zenolite. What are some largely unknown philosophers or works that you would recommend in any field? Just things you feel warrant more attention. Well, if we're talking about ancient philosophy, you should read Cicero and Plutarch. A lot of people are, well, they're derivative. No, there's some cool stuff going on there, and you can really learn a lot of important stuff from reading those two guys. And then, read other people, of course, in that canon. There's a lot of medievals who are overlooked as well. Somebody else who I'm a big fan of, who I just Thursday when I was in my office, one of my office mates, he was pointing at this Kahn Classics of Political Philosophy book, and he says, "What do you think about this? Is this good? Would you use this for students?" I said, "Well, I don't know. Let me take a look and see who he's got in there." And sure enough, once again, no Mary Wollstonecraft, no vindication of the rights of women. And I was like, well, typical Kahn, great stuff in here. A lot of stuff I like to teach, but, overlooks a major feminist theorist who is not a, sort of women are great, men suck sort of feminist, but rather we got to put things on an equal footing and do some cultural critique. And, men and women both need to get their acts together, sort of feminist. By the way, somebody who, really practiced what she preached as well. She's somebody I'd read. And as I think a lot of you know, I'm a big fan of Lev Shestov, who doesn't get read very much. Great existentialist thinker. I don't think there's a lot of lip service given to Hannah Arendt, but I don't think a lot of people actually read her stuff. They read enough to get a little tagline like banality of evil, or they talk about how in our time the origins of totalitarianism is a bestseller. It's a bestseller, but I doubt most people are actually reading it because it's a tough book and it's it's pretty dense but really brilliant. So those are people who I like. And there's we could probably come up with a lot of others. Omar, what do you think about attempting to come up with your own philosophy instead of interpreting the greats? Have all ideas been discussed to the point that originality is impossible? Well, if you want to try to come up with your own philosophy, go ahead. Then don't be surprised when you put it out there and people are like, well, this is just watered down Rousseau, or Kant already said this. The question you want to ask is, why is it instead of interpreting the greats? What's wrong with interpreting the greats? Are they just placeholders who are getting in the way of us doing our own thing, or do they put some stuff out there that's worth digging into and reinterpreting and figuring out the core ideas, what's attractive there, why they're being taught year after year after year? If you're going to come up with your own philosophy and it's going to be worth anything, it's generally going to be after spending some time studying with the greats and some of the less well-known philosophers too. But if you want to try doing your own thing, go right on ahead, see how it works out for you. Maybe it'll, work out for you great. Mohammed, are you a Hegelian or what? Nope, I'm not a Hegelian, although I use a lot of Hegel, and I'm not a Nietzschean, although I use a lot of Nietzsche, and I'm not a Kierkegaardian, although I use a lot of Kierkegaard. I can go on and on and on. I'm an eclectic. I'm like Cicero. I can say who I gravitate to the most, but I'm perfectly willing to draw upon other thinkers and approaches when I find them useful. And I try to sort of, work out a nice synthesis of these for myself and for the clients and students that I work with. The greeter, what do you think will be left of philosophy when science progresses further? It already covers physics, and with brain research improving, it will surely have a big part of epistemology too. That is the biggest bit of wishful thinking, and that has been said generation after generation after generation. The notion that somehow science clears up issues rather than, especially when it comes to human beings, leading to more and more questions being opened and more areas being made uncertain. History doesn't bear that out. And I know that there's a lot of people who'd love if that was the case, but that just isn't the case. Talk to practicing scientists and the ones who are honest about what they're doing, not ideologues, and they'll tell you that too. Neuroscience is just a mess. The assumptions that are made about what we can do with like this thing that we had, the person in the brain scan in this totally artificial circumstances. And then we did this very artificial experiment that we can know anything about epistemology or free will. That's just a joke, Even most of social psychology is, if you think about what the experiments are set up like, and then the sweeping conclusions, it's just silly, to think that somehow we rule out areas of philosophy. But again, see if that works for you. Philosophy, religion, self. You're so passionate about what you do. What were your first steps into the world of philosophy? What kept you going on and never losing your passion? Well, I can answer the other one better. I've always been like interested in this stuff, and even though I've had periods where I got sort of uncertain about what the hell the point of all this was, and even though I personally struggle with depression, I've always thought that it's there's still something to be gained out of studying philosophy, right? And I found as I mentioned in a video that I did a long time ago, I found some philosophers able to help me with that sort of thing. My first steps into the world of philosophy were probably when I was younger, but I didn't know it as philosophy, right? I just encountered ideas, and either I read about them and I thought they were cool, or I had teachers who brought them up. I've mentioned that my first actual philosophy class in high school was terrible. If that was all philosophy was, man, I would not want to do it at all, because the teacher was dry as hell. He used Martin Gardner's Whys of a Philosophical Scrivener as the textbook, and I like Martin Gardner from his columns, but that's a terrible book, at least it was from what I remembered. And he didn't encourage discussion or really thinking through things. So yeah. Kanag Levy, have you considered doing basic language tutorials geared towards some of the classic philosophers? I don't know what basic language tutorials would be. If you mean something like going over basic terms, I've done that in tutorials with people. I do individual tutoring. You might have in mind something like videos, right, or courses. But if you're talking about like getting into the level of the text and like teaching them how to read Greek or something, that's not something I'm suited for. I'm not a language teacher. I can read it, but I'm not going to be a good person to teach somebody else how to read it, right? Good Aaron, is Deleuze worth reading? Yeah, he's worth reading. I wouldn't read everything that he wrote. I enjoy reading his history of philosophy things, like his book on Nietzsche or his book on, Leibniz. And I also like that selection essays, Critical and Clinical. And every once in a while, I'll crack Anti-Oedipus and read around in it. or 1,000 plateaus. But I think I really don't like Deleuzians personally, because they usually just want to just talk about, they throw Deleuzian terms out there, and they kind of substitute that for actually thinking about stuff. And I mean, they can be fun at parties, I can tell you that, but they don't play well with other thinkers that I'm interested in. Luca, have you read Derek Parfit? What's your opinion of his work? I've only read a little bit, not enough to actually form an opinion. He might be really onto something fundamental, but again, the people who I've encountered who are really into Derek Parfit, they never really impressed me, and so that's part of. This may be very silly on my part, but that's part of how I judge who's worth spending my time on. I think that reading and thinking about a philosopher should probably have some impact on you. Lawful philosophy. Am I wrong in seeing parallels between Das Man and Arendt's analysis of Eichmann? I think of this, everyone doing it as Das Man in practice. No, I don't think you're wrong. I think that you could draw parallels between that. You could also draw parallels between similar concepts in Gabriel Marcel. The Das Man thing is coming from Heidegger, right? The they is what it's called. And there's plenty of people who are, charting out similar things. Brian, do you think Nietzsche was able to develop any values contrary to those he critiques? And if all the highest values value themselves, wouldn't Nietzsche's new values inevitably do the same? So Nietzsche isn't saying that every highest value automatically devalues itself. That's not a claim he ever makes. He's charting out how the highest values that were prevalent in Western society came to devalue themselves, in his view. But that doesn't mean that every highest value is going to do so. Was Nietzsche able to develop any values contrary to those he critiques? I would say Nietzsche was able to endorse values contrary to those he critiques, but he's kind of all over the map with that. He's not completely consistent, because he does think that it's not just nihilism everywhere, right? There's pockets of things that can be recovered. Nate, do you have any interest in the work of Nicholas Malebranche? I did back in graduate school, but I haven't read him since then, quite honestly. In part because I was very interested in Leibniz at that time too. And Malebranche and Leibniz, they're all sort of in the same milieu. He's an interesting guy. A lot of those Cartesians are pretty cool. They're a lot of fun. And, he's somebody I wish I had the time to get to, right? All right, Philosophy, Religion, Self. I see a book behind you, New Stoicism. Yeah, I was tutoring a student going through this. This is Lawrence Becker's New Stoicism. Do I recommend reading it? I recommend reading it if you want a very high-level academic treatment of what contemporary Stoicism could look like. I do not recommend it as an introductory text. And I think that this is a book, by the way. I was mentioning that Hannah Arendt's, there's something going on outside. I was mentioning that Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism is one of those books that a lot of people praise and a lot of people buy, and I think very few people actually do read all the way through. I think in the modern Stoic movement, there's a lot of people who give lip service to this, but looking at the things that they post in social media or say, there's no way that they read this book, because this is really quite complex. Becker is doing high-level theory, but if you're into that sort of thing, it's really a cool work. And I did, in fact, work through the entire text with a client of mine who's very interested in Stoicism week after week after week. Juan, hey professor, I hope you think about all the lives you changed through your videos. Your free knowledge is pure kindness. Thank you for everything. Question, do you teach your kids about philosophy? Well, that's very nice. I mean, I can't actually think about the lives I've changed through my videos, because in some respect, it's a bit of a black box. I know I see people saying, thanks, this really helped me get through a class, or, I actually had a comment today where somebody's like, whenever I get depressed, I watch one of your videos. And I thought to myself, man, you must be bad off if my videos can help you out, because they don't help me out. Although I do get enjoyment out of producing them, right? But it's, I don't really know what the impact is, quite frankly. I'm glad people benefit from it. It's rewarding doing it. It's much more intellectually and emotionally rewarding than, I'd say, financially rewarding, particularly after YouTube changed their algorithms, right? But I'm glad that it helps people, but I don't know what the impact is. Now, do I teach my kids about philosophy? I do, but I don't do it in a formulaic way. So when it comes up, I'll talk with them about philosophical issues, and I'll say, hey, here's an idea that really helped me understand this, or, we'll discuss things. Especially my son now has gotten quite interested in certain issues, certain questions. And, quite frankly, looking back on it, some of those are things I was interested in when I was his age too. And so, yeah, we do teach them about philosophy. I say we, meaning both my wife and myself. But, I don't want to push it too much, because that's how you get them to not want to do it, right? All right, Friedrich, is it progress if we bargain with ethics? I'm not sure what bargaining with ethics would mean. Do you mean like compromise our ethics, or we use ethics as a bargaining tool? Would that be progress? Progress. You always have to index progress to progress in what? Progress is not a term that has a meaning in and of itself. It always has to be indexed to something. So I don't know. Ted Kaczynski. Hopefully not the real Ted Kaczynski. Right? Back to the metal comment. What do you think of Greta Van Fleet? I don't know what the metal comment in here is. Did I miss something in here? Well, anyway, what do I think of Greta Van Fleet? I've only heard a little bit. And I don't know. It sounded okay. I mean, I listen mostly to classic metal and bands who are continuing doing that in the present. People say that they sound a lot like Led Zeppelin. I can see why that's the case. He says, I suspect you can't stop it, but please stop talking of causality. Well, I could stop it, but I'm not going to. I don't know why the hell I should. All right. Mandy, could you do a one-off video on the ancient Greek agon? I love the vase with Achilles and Ajax playing dice in the agon. Agon just means contest. Them playing dice, I suppose you could say, is a type of agon, but so is wrestling. And I don't know what I would do as a video about that. Cyrus Van Hens, Schopenhauer is better than Hegel. Well, certainly what Schopenhauer thought. And there's some people out there who believe that. Sorry, I'm human. Are you planning on making Schopenhauer content? Yeah, maybe down the line. Right now, for the time being, I've got to make a lot of core concept videos that I'm going to use in my classes this semester. So I just finished up shooting 2 Aristotle Politics Book 1 ones this morning. And then I've got to shoot some Cicero content tonight, and then I got to shoot some Augustine this coming week, and got some Hobbes stuff I got to shoot, and Wollstonecraft and all that. So it's going to be a while before I get to Schopenhauer. Now, that said, if you're really, really, really hankering for something, and this goes for anything, I do commissioned videos where somebody can actually pay me to shoot videos specifically on what they want to do. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, you can email me about that. Otherwise, you got to kind of wait until it happens, right? H. Max, do you view the world through Hegel's dialectics, right? In part. Sometimes I think some of the dialectics that he charts out are useful for understanding what does in fact happen in human behavior. I think Hegel, his discussions about nature, I just didn't, that stuff's not very usable. But his discussion about, the social world is quite often useful. Mohid Said, Dr. Sadler, I always want to know your opinions on mysticism and its conjunction with modern philosophy as well as music. I don't hold mysticism in high regard. There were a lot of people back when I was in graduate school who were, really into mystic things. I think sometimes mysticism is just a code word for, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, or this feels cool. Genuine mysticism is usually pretty disciplined. And some of that can be quite interesting, but it doesn't have much to do with modern philosophy, quite frankly. The mystics usually are sort of in the off on the side. Most of modern philosophy is pretty rationalist or empiricist in what it's doing. So, and music, I'm not that qualified to talk about music in general. I can talk about metal, but that's really about it. All right. I and thou. Do I enjoy postmodern literature? What do I think of Gravity's Rainbow and Thomas? I'm not even sure how his name's actually pronounced. Pynchon. Is it all just nonsense? So it's not all just nonsense. And I do like some literature that gets talked about as being postmodern. Some people think Philip K. Dick is postmodern. If he is, then I guess I like some postmodern literature, Borges or, other people like that. I don't like a lot of high art literature. Most of it I view as a waste of my time. I was just reading something actually preparing for a talk I'm giving on Gene Wolfe. By the way, if you want, that's pretty postmodern stuff, right? Gene Wolfe's Earth of the Book of the New Sun, Shadow of the Torturer, Sword of the Lictor, Claw the Conciliator. I'm forgetting what the other one is. And Wolfe was talking in an interview about fantasy and realistic fiction. And the interviewer was saying, it seems like in your fantasy, you're able to get at, the stuff that real people are concerned with more than a lot of people in realistic fiction. And Wolfe says, that in part because fantasy is actually closer to life than realistic fiction. Think about a lot of realistic fiction. It'll usually be about two college professors, and he's cheating on her with a student, or they're married to each other, so she's going to find somebody to cheat on him with. Angst abounds is the phrase that he has. And, is this stuff that's really relatable to us, or do we read it and then we're like, Jesus, what the hell am I wasting my time on this for? My time is valuable. I'll give you an example of one thing that is a postmodern work that I really enjoyed, and someday I hope to go back to and sort of chart out, and that's Catch-22. I liked Catch-22. It's got a sort of structure that doesn't make sense in terms of the timeline, but that's part of what makes it interesting. But so much of the stuff that's like put up there as like high literature that we should all participate in, or we're kind of Philistines. I'm content to be a Philistine, quite frankly. And so there's another question like that. I remember saying you don't like our Holy Savior Marcel Proust. Why not? Thanks for the hard work. Because I don't want to waste the time on his friggin' books. I don't care about his memories. If I want to get like the stream of consciousness stuff, and we're our memories and all that, man, I'd rather get it in the form of some good science fiction or some good philosophy, right? Same thing for like reading James Joyce. I view his stuff as just so self-indulgent, people who want to read it and they love it, great, that's fine. They can do that. It's a free country, right? We can all read whatever the hell we want. But I don't have to like stuff just because other people think it's, an important part of the canon, All right. Hossam, you have a critical thinking, logic, and argumentation YouTube channel, which you haven't received any updates for a long time. Are you still publishing things related to these topics? Not right now. I actually have it in my Patreon, like goals that if I reach a sufficient level of support on Patreon, I'll start producing new video content in that critical thinking, logic, and argumentation channel. But unless here's the thing: I'm a sort of I work for academic institutions, but that's just like, per semester. I'm not full time. So if you want to see more of one particular thing, probably you need to figure out how you want to fund that, right? Because I'm not getting funded by the state like European academics. I'm not getting funded by academic institutions to do that. It's, the internet. It's the people out there who contribute to it. And thank God for the ones who do. So, once I reach a sufficient level of support, I will start doing more critical thinking videos because I'll be able to make the time for that, Mohit, how can artists better represent ideas of philosophers? Is that even necessary for creating a sensible culture, or is it always arbitrary? That's a good question. Matter of fact, I'm gonna highlight that and put it in a little document. And the reason I'm going to do that is because this semester I am actually teaching students who are art and design students at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, and I am teaching them a philosophies of human nature course. So I'm teaching them Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and Augustine and all the way up to Hannah Arendt. And that's a great question because I'm having them do that for their final project. So yeah. All right. Slow-mo, what would you define as the major virtues? Oh, that's a good question. Do I accept the sort of cardinal virtue, wisdom, justice, temperance, courage thing that the Stoics and Platonists and a lot of Christian thinkers picked up on? Or am I more Aristotelian where I'm like, well, not everything fits into those. Not everything can be shoehorned neatly. I'm more Aristotelian, quite frankly. And so, by the way, is Alistair McIntyre. He's willing to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't try to cram them all under 4 headings. And I think that's right. McIntyre in After Virtue, when he's talking about moral inquiry and development, he says there's 3 virtues that are sort of architectonic in that you have to have them operative or you're not going to be able to make much progress. And those are justice, truthfulness, which is not exactly the same thing as just honesty, and courage. And I think that's right. I think you're going to have a hard time functioning for long, especially in our society, without some degree of temperance as well. But I think that, like Aristotle's treatments of the virtues that bear on finances, generosity or liberality, and then magnificence, I think that needs to be treated separately. And I do think that it was a mistake to try to roll anger and the proper management of anger under temperance or under courage, which is what was often done. So I think that, those are some of the big ones for me. I and thou, any books you would recommend for somebody who wants to start studying World War II and fascism? Good question. Yeah. So, Origins of Totalitarianism, definitely. Eugen Weber's Varieties of Fascism, you should read that. I like Ernst Nolte, even though a lot of people bashed him. 3 Varieties of Fascism, Action Française, Mussolini's Italy, and Hitler's National Socialism. There's a whole bunch of good, studies on fascism out there that have come out, in the last 20 years. But those are some of the classics. I would also say, if you have the stomach for it, get yourself a copy of 2 of William Shire's books. There's the one that everybody reads, or at least claims that they read, because it's like this thick, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. That's good to read. Great book. A lot of good source material. But you should also read his Fall of the French Third Republic, because that's another major part of the story. And it shows you why the democracies were not able to satisfactorily resist the rise of fascism and Nazism. All right, we're a little bit over time. I'm going to keep going. In the beginning was the splurge. Do you have much respect for David Foster Wallace? No, but I don't have much disrespect for him either. Again, I don't read a hell of a lot of contemporary authors. Again, part because I don't have time, but I also don't have the inclination. The few things I've read have not made me say, wow, I got to read more of this guy. So, as an expert on Blondell, do you think his other works will ever be translated into English? That's a great question. There was at one time talk of putting together a Blondell translation project, and like a lot of academic things, it never progressed. I'd like to, if I have the time, if I can find the time, I would like to translate more of his stuff. I did translate in my work, Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, the 1930s French Christian philosophy debates. I did translate 4 of his contributions to that debate, but that's just a drop in the bucket. Translation takes a lot of time, a lot of work. It's something that's best done in teams, I think. I'd like to see his stuff translated, but there's a lot of other stuff too I'd love to see translated as well. Dove says, Wallace is a great author who really confronted our bureaucratic world. Yeah, so is Gabriel Marcel. I mean, I think there's probably, you could say that of a lot of people. The Good Man, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky? Again, why not both? I like both of them. I guess if I had to pick one, I would pick Dostoevsky. But they're both worth reading. Omar Alexander, how can we distinguish between morality and ethics? You can distinguish if you want to, but it's a waste of time. Everybody who makes a distinction between morality and ethics, it winds up being a bit different than everybody else's distinction, and then you have to explain the distinction. And they're both coming from the same thing, ethos and mores, right? They're both having to do with this whole practical realm. So I don't bother making that distinction myself. Now, that's not to say I dismiss people who do. I mean, Hegel himself makes a distinction between it, but I don't bother with that. Here's a really interesting one from I and Thou. Is Camus' Sisyphus just the night of infinite resignation? Is there any difference between them? I mean, I guess you could say it's similar. Camus' Sisyphus is not somebody who's embracing the ethical, right? You would want somebody different than that. Somebody who's closer to the tragic hero. Sisyphus is not a tragic hero. He's a jerk who got condemned for doing the wrong thing, and now he's got to figure out what the hell he's going to do with his eternal punishment. So yeah, I think there's some difference between them. Philosopher, you said elsewhere Socrates is being sarcastic when he says he knows only that he knows nothing. Could you expand on that? I think he's serious, but he's not being literal. He's referring to an attitude. I don't know what all that means. I mean, if he's not being literal, what the hell is he saying? An attitude of not knowing? I don't know what that means. But Socrates, I didn't say he's being sarcastic. I said he might be being ironic. Socrates definitely knows all sorts of things, even in the dialogue, the Apology. Just, you got to read it, and you'll see him asserting things that have to be claims about knowledge. You can't work without any knowledge. So, you have to kind of contextualize this I know that I don't know kind of business. Is it something you can totally globalize? I don't think so. And then, you look at the later dialogues. He gets people all the time to admit that we know this, we know this, we know this, right? Pedro Alexander, would you agree that all actions ultimately come from a selfish point of view, seeing one can deconstruct any action into a self-satisfactory outcome? Well, I wouldn't even say you can do that. I mean, you can interpret every action as a self-satisfactory outcome, and then there's some exceptions you have to deal with. But you certainly can play that game if you want to. But, and this is something moral theorists have been pointing out, you got to do so much like totally, skewing things in order to make that plausible, that at a certain point, most people are like, come on, really? And the fact that you can make an argument about something doesn't mean it's a good argument. So would I agree all actions ultimately come from a selfish point of view? No. I mean, I think we have a pluralism of reasons why we do things, you know. Richard, what's the best thing we can take away from studying Hegel for our lives today? What good is he? Well, again, I'd say particular dialectics, right? And don't, just jump to the master-slave dialectic, because that's not the key for understanding everything. You get into the reason and spirit section. There's a lot of really cool stuff in there that you can see sort of playing itself out. This is a point I've made many times in the commentary videos. You can see it playing itself out today. So, yeah. Let's see. What's your opinion on the attitude of which Arthur Schopenhauer took towards the will? You mean like the interpretation that he has of the will? I think it's pretty interesting. It's well worth checking out. Do I think that everything is ultimately at bottom, will, and then what it makes of things? No, but I like Schopenhauer quite a bit. Emil, have you watched Jordan Peterson's biblical series? No. When the hell would I have the time to do that, right? No, I haven't done that. All right, the thing just scrolled up again. Venner, what do you think about Stephen Molyneux's theory on morality, UPB? I haven't watched Molyneux for years. Back when I did, I thought he was a hack, and basically just, a guy who got in early on the internet phase, had a great shtick that appealed to a lot of people that were attracted to his variety of libertarianism. And I haven't watched him for a long time, so I couldn't tell you much about him. Christopher Moklabust. I've read some of the pessimists like Schopenhauer, Leopardi, and I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Choron, maybe Curon. But I was wondering if you could list off some good optimistic thinkers within philosophy. Depends on what you mean by optimist. Do you mean like Pollyannish, everything's coming up roses, or people that say that we have good reason to hope, but we might have to work our asses off in order to make those reasons effective? I mean, in that case, the Stoics are optimists, right? Probably most philosophers are optimists in that sense. So, Brewmaster, does Hegel being an inspiration to Marxist and fascist governments and philosophies accept how you view his writings? No. I mean, most of what they made of Hegel, and quite frankly, Nietzsche's got you. If you want to make that sort of claim, fascist stuff comes more from Nietzsche than from Hegel, right? I mean, just be straight about that. It also comes more from Auguste Comte, and Marxists. I mean, did the Marxists really read Hegel closely or carefully? No, So no, that doesn't work that way. But I also don't stop reading Nietzsche because they used him for that sort of thing. And I read people for the sake of reading the people, and I try to see what's in their thought. And then, if their thought was used in an unfortunate way, that's unfortunate, right? And then you say, well, this is either a tendency within their thought, and they align themselves up with it. Like when Heidegger's Black Notebooks came out, we saw that, Heidegger really was a Nazi, right? Does that invalidate being in time? No. But when he starts talking about, say, destiny or, races, be on guard, right? The Good Man, thoughts about psychedelics. I mean, people who are into them, go ahead, do them. If you think that you're getting something out of it. I think this thing about opening up like the inner eye or the mind or something through psychedelics, I don't buy that myself. If that is useful for that, it's something that you would then have to like follow up on by using actual mental discipline of some sort. 2046, question on the relationship between modern science and teleological explanations and whether teleology is needed for ethical naturalism. Well, you're going to need teleological explanations to account for human behavior, aren't you? And the more that we look at animal behavior, you're going to need some sort of limited teleological explanations for that. Doesn't mean that the teleological explanations that people gave are always great. Just sort of like the Candide thing of, what are ears for? Well, they make it really convenient when we want to balance our spectacles. That sort of nonsense is kind of bad. But yeah. Kill Doggy. Are there funny philosophy books I could recommend? Voltaire's Candide is one of the only ones that made me laugh. Yeah, Voltaire has a whole bunch of other funny books too. Funny philosophy books. Plato's kind of funny in some places, right? Some of the stuff going on in the dialogues, especially like the Symposium. Depends on what your sense of humor is, right? If it's a dry sense of humor, then, there's funny stuff throughout the history of philosophy. I was actually just reading C.D. Broad's 5 Types of Moral Theories this morning, and I didn't realize it, but he's a funny guy. Some of the quips that he has, but that's dry humor, right? It's not like in your face sort of humor. Chad Whiteman, did Wittgenstein really end philosophy? Obviously not, Patrick Gallagher, did you see the Peterson-Harris debates? If so, what do you think about each thinker? I have not seen the debates. I haven't had the time, but I don't hold either in high esteem. So that's part of the reason why I haven't gone to see the debates, right? I think of them as people who are interesting at this time, and they're going to be flashes in the pan like Herbert Spencer was in British philosophy. There's all these people. People are also asking about Zizek. I don't think people are going to be reading Zizek, 50, 100 years from now, except for people who are like, doing history of ideas. All right. A little absurdity in my hands. What are your thoughts on existentialism's relevance at the time it came around as a solid concept? Is relevance relative, or was it needed as an effect of the conflicts of the time? Well, existentialism didn't come about as one like massive thing that all happened at the same time. There's waves of it. And was it relevant at the time? Yeah, and it's relevant now too. It's just not always the same parts of it. And it's not as if there's one single agreement on what existentialism is. By the way, anybody who tries to tell you that the existentialist position is this, they're full of crap. Don't believe them. They've just read some Sartre, or they read some Camus, or they read a textbook, and they think they know what existentialism and all the existentialists think about something. The existentialists are kind of all over the map on most topics, so you have to actually index it to who there are. Here's a good one from MA. I'll answer a few more questions that I'm going to have to take off in a bit, do some housework. What philosophy courses would you recommend for an economics major trying to minor in philosophy? That's a good question. If they have a philosophy of economics course, definitely take that, right? I think you want to look at the moral philosophy courses, right? And you probably also want to do the history of philosophy courses that are available, because they give you some of that background in the history of ideas. Economics comes out of philosophy. I was actually just talking about that today. Part of what's on the board there is oikonomike, the art of household management. Aristotle's talking about that in Politics, Book 1. So that's something worth thinking about. In the beginning was the splurge. Do you consider it failure when philosophers can't live up to their own philosophy? For example, Schopenhauer pushing a lady down the stairs and living the life of luxury while moaning about suffering. I consider it an interesting biographical detail, but I don't think that it invalidates their philosophical position. It's unless they make it absolutely central themselves, in which case it's kind of their own fault, right? That said, I kind of, like I said, I decide who's worth spending my time on by the kind of people who endorse them. So, that has something for me. Stanton, let's see here. I just scrolled up again. Here, Stanton Monatan. Should I feel bad for liking analytic philosophy more than philosophy's history? No, you don't have to feel bad about it. It's good that you recognize it, right? Different people are attracted to different things in philosophy. Some people love the emphasis on, nice short, reading selections, and they like the analytics, sort of focus on argumentation and clarity and rigor. I don't think analytic philosophy is actually all that clear a lot of the time. And if you talk about stuff and somebody else has talked about it before and did so in a very intelligent way in the history of philosophy, and you are reinventing wheels, that's a problem. But I think that there's different personality types, there's different ages of life, there's different support systems. You may go to a school where all the professors are into analytic philosophy and nobody can really help you out with history of ideas. So I wouldn't feel bad. Just realize that that's going to impose certain limitations, right? Certain problems. Let me take 3x4 architectures. Have I read Kiesel's Genesis of Being in Time? I have not. So sounds like an interesting work, but I don't read much secondary literature, quite frankly, because I spend too much time on primary literature. So, there's only so much time left. Sage Master, could Socrates have been referring to the concept of akasha, knowing emptiness itself in meditation as a no thing instead of completely nothing? I highly doubt it. That would be an extraordinary thing if he was. There's really no evidence that other than Pyrrho of Ellis, that there was any sort of influx of Indian philosophy coming into Greek philosophy until long after that. So no, I wouldn't. And this is sort of a broader thing. You can always find parallels between things. Don't think that means there's a genetic connection between them. All right, Katrina Baby, do you consider yourself a Christian apologist like Kierkegaard? Kierkegaard was not a Christian apologist. So that's a non-starter right there. Kierkegaard actually said that most Christians aren't Christians. They just think that they are, and he was trying to make Christianity more difficult. Apologists do the opposite thing. They're trying to make it easier for everybody. They're trying to remove doubts and stuff like that. Am I? No. That's not my job. My job is to read stuff, think stuff, talk about it. If it happens to be Christian thinkers, that's great. But I'm not an evangelist. I'm not trying to bring anybody to one particular thing. Let's see here. A little absurdity in my hands. Do you view nihilism itself as a potentially toxic way of thinking, or is it the interpretation? It depends on what form of nihilism. Nihilism is an equivocal term as well. It's meant different things. If you're meaning by it what Nietzsche meant by it, which I think is a good index point, it is a toxic way of thinking, and it is also an interpretation, a constant reinterpretation, not just of a way of thinking, but a way of acting and valuing and behaving. But if you're a nihilist, man, life sucks. There isn't any meaning. So, all right. Let me see if I can take one more thing. And before I finish up, all right, this is a good one to go out on. I'm going to wait for Dimitri to finish writing this, and then I'm going to take that one. Actually, I'll start reading it now while he's writing it. I'm curious to see your reaction to this post. I am a 36-year-old with a PhD in philosophy. I'm $450K in debt, currently working 2 minimum wage jobs in order to stay alive. I work alongside 18-year-olds, and whenever they ask about my background, I just tell them I've been in prison for a long time, which is less embarrassing than admitting the truth. I am probably and I'm waiting to see the last part of that. But I mean, I'll say one thing to begin with. 450,000 in debt for a philosophy degree. I don't know how the hell you do that. Even like, down over here at Marquette, where you can pay 50 grand a year for tuition and room and board. That would be 9 years, right? And generally you're on some sort of assistantship somewhere. So that's an extraordinary amount of debt. I mean, I know people who are like 100 grand in debt after their graduate studies, but I don't know anybody who's that's sort of medical school level. Dimitri's continuing, perhaps in the world, my 1,500 page biography of his life has been, we're missing something in there, rejected several dozen times. No college will take me on since I don't think Husserl is relevant, and that other applicants are therefore pushed to the head of the line. I'm not sure what's up with that, but so this doesn't seem like a coherent story, but the question is, I work alongside 18-year-olds. Whenever they ask me about my background, I just tell them I've been in prison for a long time, which is less embarrassing than admitting the truth. Okay, yeah, that's understandable. People do that. Publishing things doesn't earn you any money or recognition generally. I mean, academic publishing doesn't do that. Okay, just moved to Louisiana. There's a job opening at the university. Decided to go all out in order to get it. That's great. So found out my application was rejected. Well, I don't know why you would move somewhere unless there's actually a job. It's not the way it works in philosophy, right? First you get interviewed, then you do that. So this sounds actually like a made up story, and if it's not, then you're really in an unfortunate place. But there's so many details about this that don't fit what actually works and happens in the academic world. So yeah. But there are a lot of people who are, caught up in crappy circumstances. I'll tell you about a colleague of mine who has dropped off the face of the earth. She, got stuck in this thing where she would teach like 2 years here and 2 years there and a year here. You're always spending time trying to apply for new jobs, and then you have to interview and you have to move over and over again. You can't accumulate any wealth. You lose your network of friends every time that you go. That's a very hard life. And there's a lot of academics who are in that situation, and it kind of sucks. But, those are the realities that we're currently faced with. I worked for my first 6 years in a maximum security prison, went to many interviews. The job that I was offered was at a 4-year historically black college, struggling to stay open in the South. And I went down there and then, went out back to New York to live with my wife, wound up teaching part-time. It's rough all over the place, right? So, yeah. So somebody's saying this is a stolen copy pasta from 4chan. Yeah, it sounds like the sort of thing. Sounds like the sort of thing that's written by somebody who has some familiarity with academics, but not that much from the inside. But all right, so on that, we're going to end. We went a little bit over time. Thanks for all the questions and comments. And again, those of you who want to make some sort of contribution to what I'm doing, you can easily find the Patreon page. It's just Patreon/Stoicism Sadler, and I'll see you guys either next month for the AMA, or we do have our Dr. Sadler Dr. Sadler pop-ups coming up later this month, and I'll be talking about ethics and some other topics concerned with that as well. So hope all of you have a great evening, morning, day, wherever you happen to be.